Bobby Anderson is the supervisor for the Exhibits and Displays section of the U.S. Botanic Gardens horticulture team. Bobby has an extensive background in production horticulture, horticultural displays, and greenhouse facility operations. He has served as a member of the core planning team for the U.S. Botanic Gardens' upcoming agriculture exhibit, Cultivate, Growing Food in a Changing World, where he has led the development of the indoor agriculture section of the exhibit that you're going to see today. We are so glad to have him joining us today, and with that, I will turn things over to you, Bobby.
Hey everyone. So we're going to cover a few different systems today. The first is going to be a precision drip system. We will then go to a fertigation system that supports the precision drip system. We'll then move over and show you a recirculating deep water culture system that you would find more in a home environment. And then from there, we'll show you some microgreen production and a nutrient film technique system and hint at the idea of vertical farming within that system. So behind me is a precision drip system. We built this here in South Transition. You can see tomatoes, and we have jalapenos, and there's some strawberries down here as well. So one of the big ideas we want to highlight in this part of this exhibit is this is kind of a representation of what you would find in a commercial hydroponic greenhouse. Precision drip irrigation allows you to get nutrients and water exactly where they need to be. It also reduces the amount of water and nutrients that you need to provide to your plants. It gives you more control. So here is a very small version of what a drip system would look like. We have a solenoid that controls flow to the main line. We have a bleed off valve that allows you to flush your line if you need to. And then we have the actual drip stake. And so the drip stake has a hard plastic component that you stick into the pot or the slab you're growing in. Allows the water to remain and go where exactly it needs to be. We have a feeder tube, and then we have a pressure compensating emitter. And that pressure compensating emitter allows all of your stakes to start dripping at the same time to keep your water even and distributed throughout the system. So one of the things we wanted to talk about in this kind of system is it's more meant for longer cycle crops. So things like tomatoes and peppers and strawberries, cucumbers, eggplant, things that take a lot more time to grow than say lettuce or leafy greens, microgreens. And with that then requires different kinds of support and trellising. So here's a pretty basic piece of trellising. It's a piece of string. You have these plastic clips that connect to the plant itself. You have a hook that goes over your support for your trellis. And then in order to extend this, you would then clip, and then you can extend more rope down to give you more trellis space. So our irrigation just kicked on. We'll bring you down here. And so in a minute or so, you'll start to see this vessel start to fill. So another type of trellising that we have in here is essentially a long piece of stainless wire with a clip on it. And that clip clips around your plant, onto your stake, and then you can slide it up and down based upon the growth of the plant. So there are different kinds of medias that you can use in this kind of system. We're growing in a cocoa fiber substrate. It's a combination of chunky cocoa and peat cocoa. And that cocoa provides structure for the plants, but then also gives an area for that nutrient solution to disperse through evenly. There are all kinds of different hydroponic substrates that people can use. Cocoa is a pretty sustainable type as it's a byproduct of the coconut industry. There are things like rock wool cubes and expanded clay pellets, peat. Some people even used to grow in gravel. We'll keep moving on through here. So this should start filling in just a minute here. But yeah, so this is basically an example of a large-scale hydroponic commercial greenhouse that you would find. We built this system to fit our needs. In a large-scale system, you probably wouldn't find all of these crops growing together. You'd probably have a monoculture, to be honest, and then you would tune your system to really meet the needs of that system. Should be picking up in just a minute.
While we're waiting to watch, we had a question. It's a great question. How old is that tomato vine behind you?
So these tomatoes were started back in August. There's 11 plants in this display. And the vines are probably approximately 10 to 15 feet long at this point.
Maybe, I don't know if people can see, but can you talk about the lean and lower and how as they've grown, that the sort of way that they're configured has changed?
Yeah, so the technique we're using with the tomatoes is called a lean and lower technique. So as the tomato grows up vertically, we support it with the trellis. And once it hits the top of our trellis, we'll actually slide the plant down and move it horizontally. And so the root base in the pot stays in the same location, where the top of the plant tends to move along the system. And eventually you get a long strand of vines that you see behind us. And the hope is to have these tomatoes growing for the full term of our exhibit. And they could reach 50 to 100 feet.
Great. And someone asked, do you use a specific type of tomato in there?
So the cultivar we picked is meant for this specific kind of environment, this type of production. It has a bunch of different like disease hardiness, and it's like phytophthora resistant. It's powdery mildew resistant. So picking the cultivar that you are looking to grow is really important within the system that you're choosing to build.
Someone asked Bobby about the light in there. Are you using natural light or LED?
So right now we're just using natural light. In a large scale and production greenhouse, you would probably have some supplemental lighting. So one thing we've noticed is as these tomatoes have grown, the stems have actually gotten thinner in the winter because there is less light. And so the stems are about like an inch thick through the fall, and they've gone down to about a 1/2 inch thick because of those lower light levels.
Someone else asked about pollination. That's an interesting question. They asked, how do large-scale setups like this promote pollination of flowers on things like tomatoes and peppers in the indoor environment?
So we actually have a little tool that's a pollinator. It kind of looks like an electric toothbrush and it vibrates. We've actually gotten pretty lucky and haven't had to do much hand pollination. All the tomatoes you see have actually pollinated themselves. We haven't had to really intervene with it at all.
Great. And then another person was asking about, do you remove the lower leaves of those tomatoes as they're growing?
Yeah, so as we lean and lower, we'll remove the bottom leaves. And so we basically have leaves in at this point, it's the top third of the entire vine. That'll increase as the plants continue to grow. But yeah, we tend to keep the foliage up top and then the fruit hangs down below.
Got it. And then what about pests? Are you dealing with any pests in there? And if so, how would you handle that?
We've actually gotten very fortunate in terms of pests on the tomatoes. We've had very little, couple black aphids here and there. And we've used omni-listed pesticides, mostly oils. And we've actually done 1 or 2 treatments, and that was at the end of the summer. We haven't treated these plants with anything in months at this point. We've also used beneficial insects, various mites and parasitoids that help to control pest populations. But then again, we haven't really needed them because we haven't had many pests in the exhibit.
Thanks. And then someone asked, what are your most challenging growing aspects in that system? What are your biggest challenges?
In this kind of system, it's just keeping up with the plants, to be honest. The plants are growing very quickly. We had cucumbers in here a few months ago, and it was like they were growing like 6 inches a day. And so it's like having to move them down on the trellis every couple of days. You can imagine when you have an acre of greenhouse, I mean, it takes a lot of work and a lot of maintenance in order to keep those plants healthy and looking good.
And then it's harder for us to see, but down below you have the strawberries. Can you tell us a little about the strawberries and how you're growing and managing those?
So they're growing in a cocoa fiber substrate as well, and you can see the drip lines going into them. So they kind of slowed down in the fall, and they're just starting to perk back up now, getting ready for spring. Now that the light levels are starting to extend again. In a commercial greenhouse, you could supplement with LED lighting and things like that to where the plants wouldn't really slow down all that much. But yeah, it's a different percentage of coqui to peat cocoa than the tomatoes and the jalapenos. It's a little bit more of a peat cocoa substrate with a little bit of chunky, and the ratio of chunky to peat really changes our airspace and the amount of air that's available to the plant roots at a given point in time. And so it really depends on the crop you're growing for the blend you're going to make.
Thanks. And then one more question on the strawberries. Someone asked, how do you handle runners on the strawberries? And they also asked about what variety and how large each pot is. Can you talk about some of those details?
Sure. So the runners we just cut off. We're not really, we don't really need them. So we're just focusing on the strawberry production. And so one of the ideas we really wanted to get across is building the system to meet your needs. And so this system was built in order to educate the public on technology improvements within agriculture. And so some of the stuff you see here may not be what you would find exactly in a commercial operation, but we built in a certain way in order to get our message and get our educational component through. So that's what, yeah, whenever you're building a system, you really want to know what your goal is, what the end result you want to be, and then do the research in order to fit that goal before you buy or build anything. Research is very inexpensive compared to buying all of these different pieces to try and throw something together. So that's one of the things is we're growing in these air pots. And so they're aesthetically pleasing, they'll hold up well for our show, but at a commercial operation, this wouldn't make sense. These pots are I don't know, 100 times more expensive than, say, a grow bag, which costs a couple pennies. So in a commercial operation, you would never find something like this, but this fit our needs for this exhibit.
I don't know if you're able, Bobby, but someone asked about the growing medium. Are you able to show us some of that?
Sure. Actually, let's pull this out. So we'll get you an up-close look at this cocoa fiber. So the peat is the very small stuff, and then we have this chunkier type. There are all kinds of growing medias. For example, a lot of people like to grow in rockwool cubes, and so it has a little hole to put your plant. You can actually stack these on top of each other for a larger plant. And rock wool is a really good media, but it dries out very quickly. So our irrigation would have to go off many, many times a day, to where with this coconut fiber substrate, we only have to run our irrigation once a day, which really is beneficial. So say a power outage happens, these plants aren't going to die in a cocoa media, where in a rock wool media, they may dry out and die that quickly. I mean, these things can dry out in a few hours, where these things could last a couple days.
Thanks. We have a couple of questions about where you are right now. So someone asked if you were at the production facility. He's actually in the conservatory right now in the south transition where this is set up. And a few questions wanting to know what's the temperature in there, and then questions around ventilation and humidity in that space.
So our temperature is around 70 degrees. This is actually one of our spaces in this building that is actually heated and air conditioned, which makes it really useful for us. And so it stays about 70 year round. It is a lot drier now that it's winter and our humidity has dropped a little bit, but we haven't really noticed a whole lot of changes in the plants because of that, and so we haven't looked to modify that humidity. If you were having problems with low humidity, you could add a humidifier to your system, or if you're having problems with too much humidity, you could add a dehumidifier to your system. And fresh air exchange is really important for growing plants. You can see the plants moving behind me a little bit. So we do have the HVAC is blowing on it actively, and that's keeping the air moving and whatnot. In a production style greenhouse, you probably find circulation fans doing that same thing.
Great, thank you. We had a question which might be a great transition to the next thing that you wanted to show us. Somebody asked, what are you feeding the plants? And so Bobby is going to show us the fertigation system that's on the other side of the room where he is right now. So
here's an example of a fertigation system. And so fertigation is essentially irrigation plus nutrients. And so we have a tank that is our water supply, and then we have a pump that fuels the system. It goes up through a filter, which is up here, and a pressure regulator. And then it goes through a series of injectors. And so we have 3 injectors here. We're running an AB hydroponic nutrient in this system. It's a fairly easy and pretty intermediate level hydroponics. We have an A component, which is a mixture of a bunch of things, and then we have a B component, which is mostly it's calcium nitrate. And our third dosatron is actually a pH buffer, and so this is a pH down solution that'll lower our pH if we need to. So within hydroponics, you want to maintain like a 5.5 to 6.5 pH. Plants absorb nutrients differently at different pH ranges, and you can actually find charts online that show that. And so letting your pH fluctuate a little bit in between that range is useful to make sure that you have enough uptake of all of your nutrients. Say if you ran your pH at like a 7, you would be limiting some of those nutrients that absorb on a lower pH, such as iron. And if you continue to run it at a 7, eventually iron would not be absorbed as easily, and your plants would tend to yellow out. So after the first 2 dosatrons, you see a mixing chamber. And that's essentially just make sure that those nutrients being injected into the water supply are well blended. And then they go into the pH buffer. That gets blended again. And then it goes through a testing site, which is here. And that testing site has an EC probe and a pH probe. And we monitor the levels that are going into our system continuously. And then you can see next to that's the tester there, and then next to it we have an irrigation controller, and it's a pretty easily programmed device that allows us to essentially set the time of day we want our irrigation to run, and then the duration that we want that irrigation to run for. And once that is in there, we then tell it as soon as like an irrigation schedule is to start, it opens the solenoid to the appropriate irrigation zone that we have, and then it turns on the pump. And so the irrigation zone is open, the pump kicks on, water starts flowing through the injectors, injecting the appropriate amount of nutrients into the water, and then those drip stakes make sure that water and that nutrient ends up exactly where it needs to be.
Bobby, someone was asking, do you ever need to drain out that system and refill it?
Yeah, so flushing and cleaning your system is very important. Cleanliness in any kind of growing system is highly important for pest and disease issues. But then on top of that, with these kinds of systems, just making sure your components are working properly helps to overcome pitfalls. It's like if you're not cleaning your things regularly, something gets clogged. All of a sudden you may not inject the appropriate amount of nutrients, or something may go off. So in a batch style system, which is even more basic than this, you would mix your nutrients directly into your tank with your water. And from there you would pump it out into your irrigation zones with your drip stakes. But that then requires you to mix every batch individually, which takes time. The nice thing about this is we basically fill our stock tanks, make sure our tank has water in it, and the controller runs everything else. So it reduces the amount of time and maintenance that we have to put into it. But yeah, cleanliness is key for any type of growing system.
Thanks. And then someone else was asking what added nutrients are going in there?
So it's a lot of stuff. So I mean, you have all your macro and your micronutrients. And so in a more advanced system, you would have all of those things in individual tanks. And so instead of 2 tanks here with nutrients, you'd have like 10 or 12, depending on your blend and your recipe. And you'd have a much more sophisticated controller and a lot more injectors. And you'd be able to then tune your nutrient solution to a specific crop. We're feeding a pretty generic nutrient solution because we're growing a variety of things. And so in a commercial operation, you would really tune that nutrient solution to the specific crop, but production is not our goal. Education is our goal. We wanted to show a variety of things, and so we picked a pretty general solution. That was also something that is a lot easier for someone to do at home compared to having 10 different tanks and a controller that costs tens of thousands of dollars.
Thank you. Somebody asked, do you ever have algae buildup from the nutrients?
So yeah, so if when you get water with nutrients in it, so nutrient solution plus sunlight, you're gonna get algae. And so one of the biggest things is making sure that any nutrient solution is not really exposed to light. You can actually see these mixing chambers are a little dark right now because they have a little algae growing in them. We do clean them periodically, but it's something that's always going to happen. And so one thing that's important with our pots over here is to make sure that there's enough time to dry down in between irrigation cycles. And so the surface of the pot's not staying wet, because if the surface of the pot is staying wet, you will eventually get algae growth on that surface.
Thanks. Earlier you were talking about pH, and someone was asking about with the cocoa fiber, do you make any adjustments in terms of that impacting the pH in terms of what nutrients you give it?
So we bought a pre-buffered cocoa fiber. There are different ways you can buy cocoa fiber. You can buy it in compressed bales, and a lot of times you have to soak it and condition it essentially before you use it. The same with rock wool. It's like rock wool straight out of a package. You need to soak in a lower pH solution overnight or whatnot in order to get its internal pH correct. So we went with an easier solution and bought a pre-buffered mix, and just kind of take some of the effort out of that for us. On a commercial scale, that may not make sense because it is a little bit more expensive. But for a home grower or an exhibit like this, it does make sense.
Thank you. And then we have a question around requirements, certifications, inspections for greenhouses that are growing food indoors. Can you speak about that a little bit?
There are definitely a lot of governing bodies when it comes to that, and it has a lot to do with who you sell to. I don't believe if it comes to farmers markets and things like that, you may have a health inspector or something like that show up, or the Department of Agriculture. But if you're selling to larger companies, they generally require some sort of food safety certification, and that's a big process that you go through, making sure you're doing all the correct things, that things are clean, hand washing stations, and all of that type of stuff is involved. So if you're just doing this at your home, though, you shouldn't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff.
Thanks, Bobby. That's a great transition because we have a system that is an example of some of the technologies that could be used in the home. So should we go over and check that area out now?
So here we have an example of what someone may have in their home. So we have a grow tent with LED lights. And this is a recirculating deep water culture system that we're currently growing pineapples in. So you can see our LED lights here. They are hooked up to a controller that we have over here, an environmental controller. That environmental controller turns lights on and off, turns fans on and off. We have a sensor that's hanging up. It's hard to see because of the light, but it's reading temperature and humidity. It's also recognizing that the lights are on. And so it's like you put lights into a box and you're going to generate heat. And so getting that heat out of your system is important. So we have a fan up top here is actually pulling excess heat out. It's not really that important in this system because the doors on this tent are open all the time. But in a home environment, you'd probably close the doors in order to maintain whatever environment you're trying to create within that tent or basement or wherever you're growing. So deep water recirculating deep water culture is more of a kind of a true hydroponics. So we have plants with roots directly in nutrient solution. And so we have 8 buckets here. They're all connected together, and they're connected to this external reservoir here. And what this external reservoir allows us to do is hook up one water chiller to the entire system, hook one pH and EC controller here to the entire system, and one air stone or air pump to the entire system. So in deep water culture and any other type of hydroponics to where your roots are directly in a nutrient solution, you need to highly aerate the solution to make sure there's enough oxygen in your water. If there's not enough oxygen, it leads to disease and other problems. Essentially, your roots will die off. So, and you could do so. A deep water culture system is essentially an individual bucket that you would be growing in. But the nice thing about linking all of these up is that it reduces maintenance. So instead of having to drain 8 buckets and refill 8 buckets and make sure the temperature is right within 8 buckets, I hook it up to the main central reservoir, and the entire system drains at once. Our chiller keeps our water in the appropriate temperature range, which is 68 to 70 degrees. And that temperature helps to prevent things like root rot disease and things like that. When your roots get too hot, they get stressed, they become susceptible to disease. So the healthier your plants are, the less problems you're going to have with pest and disease overall. So, and then we also have another tank in this system that keeps the water level in this tank consistent. And so as plants transpirate, they pull water out of the system. If you don't replace that water, your nutrient levels increase. And your pH fluctuates. And so we have one tank that tops off this entire system to help keep things consistent. And consistency is really key in production. You don't want big changes, big swings. And so this whole system holds about 70 gallons of water, and 70 gallons of water changes slower than, say, 5 gallons of water. And so that larger system that provides more buffer, provides more consistency, and greater success long term.
Thanks, Bobby. We have a question about the lights in there. Can you talk about the type of LED lights that are being used in there?
So we're using they're strip bar LEDs. So it's 2 fixtures, and each of those fixtures has 4 strips in it. That helps to provide a really even canopy of light versus like a centralized bulb. So the light is being directed and provided evenly over the entire growing canopy. It helps reduce hot spots, so say like a high pressure sodium lamp, the space right underneath of that lamp is going to have more light than, say, a foot from that or 2 feet from the center of that light. And so by having these strip LEDs, we can provide really even, consistent lighting. The LED technology has also gotten a lot better in the past 10 years. I remember the LEDs I bought 10 years ago, and I mean, these things are blowing them out of the water. They're also tunable, and so if your plants are getting too much light, you can decrease the amount of light that they're outputting. So they're currently at 100%, but you can knock that down to 50% if you wanted. Some people will even ramp their lights up and then ramp them down at the beginning and end of their day. And so instead of just being 100% on when they kick on, they'll go 25%, then 50%, and then 100%.
Thanks. Someone had a question about when do you expect the pineapples to fruit under the grow lights?
We don't know. This is a first for me, so we'll see. Hopefully this summer. The plants are about a year old now, and it takes about 2 years to grow a pineapple. So we're hoping that they start to fruit in the next several months, and we'll see. Let's experiment.
Thanks. We have a question about is each pot fed individually and how do you control the flow rate?
So the nutrient solution in the entire system is the same. And one thing that's really nice about having a fertigation system in this area is we can basically drag a hose from that fertigation system, dial our injectors to meet the nutrient blend we need, and then fill the entire system with the appropriate nutrient solution. So a lot of times you'd have to like mix a batch in a bucket or a big tank and then add it in, to where we have a fertigation system to where we can just fill this up in a few minutes instead of having to take the time to mix an individual batch for the system. What was the second part of that question?
Oh, controlling the flow rate.
So there was a pump behind this main reservoir, and the flow is not massively important. It probably takes, like, so when I add a pH buffer to the main reservoir, you'll see a very big spike in the drop of that pH because you're adding your pH down directly into the vessel that has the tester. But as the water starts to move around, that pH will slowly increase as it homogenizes into the solution. And so it took a little bit of time to figure out exactly how much I needed to add for it to balance out. It takes, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes to fully balance out. So it's not you're not looking for an incredible amount of flow in this kind of system. It's just making sure everything is nicely homogenized as the water moves through. That pump also then sends the water through the water chiller. So that pump circulates the water through the system, but then also through the chiller itself.
Thanks, Bobby. There's a question about humidity. If there's a humidity monitor and you said it was hooked up, does it automatically turn on and off, or is it manual? How does that work?
So the sensor is running at all times. And so we're reading temperature, humidity, and then if the lights are on and off with that sensor at all times. We don't have a humidifier or a dehumidifier in this system. It was just determined that it wasn't needed for the space. But if you needed that, you could hook it up to the controller that we're using. It would then automatically turn that humidifier or that dehumidifier on and off based upon the reading that sensor is picking up.
Thanks. And then we had a question about how did you start the pineapple plant?
So that we actually started them in a regular potting soil mix just to get them going, and then we transferred them to the hydroponics. So these plants were bought as tissue cultured plants. So we didn't just take the top of a pineapple, which you can do. But we bought in tissue cultured pineapple plants and then applied them to our system.
Thanks. And if you weren't growing pineapples in there, what else would grow well in that sort of a system?
All kinds of things. So like we had all kinds of peppers in here before the pineapples. We had I think 4 different varieties of pepper. You could grow tomatoes, you can grow cucumbers, you can grow, I mean, anything that'll grow in a deep water culture system, you could grow in a tent like this. But it probably wouldn't make sense to grow something like tomatoes, which grows outside very well in our area, in a grow tent. It just may not make sense cost-wise. But say you're in an area that is cold all year round, it may make sense to grow tomatoes in a system like this.
Thanks. And we had a question, just we've seen now 2 systems. Which of those takes more maintenance?
It depends on the scale. So like drip irrigation systems for like a home garden are pretty low maintenance. It's like as soon as everything's set up and you have a good water supply, it's really not a lot of maintenance. And like a drip irrigation system that we're using here could actually be applied to soil as well. So you could do that in like a home vegetable garden. You basically just then reduce the amount of time that you have to spend watering on your own. You could then also inject like an organic nutrient if you wanted. Organic nutrients tend to be a lot thicker than synthetic. And so they tend to clog emitters a little bit more. So you may have to flush your system out on a more regular basis. But then again, if you're growing in soil, you may be able to use like organic powder nutrients that you could place into your soil beforehand and just use the drip lines to irrigate, to provide your water. These systems do require some maintenance. You need to drain them and refill them every couple of weeks. If you don't do that, you tend to have buildup of pathogen, and biofilms and things like that tend to start growing in them. But so depends on what your goals are.
Thanks. We have a couple more questions about starting the plants that you have in there, or that you could put in that system. Someone asked, how do you start the plants before you put them in the hydroponic system? Did you use seeds or wood one? And then what do they look like when you put them in the pots?
So you can use seeds and cuttings in this type of system. If you're going to use seeds, you probably start in like a rockwool cube or an oasis cube. Allow that to grow up a little bit. So you can basically start a seed in a rockwool cube in a tray under lights that you dip into a hydroponic nutrient, essentially, something with a lower EC, because a starter plant doesn't necessarily need the EC levels that these mature plants do. And then you would transfer it into this kind of system. So when we had peppers in here, we used cuttings. And so we had an aeroponic cloner, which essentially sprays a fine mist of nutrient solution onto the base of a cutting. And then they root out into that space. You then take a rooted cutting with no substrate, and then you would put it into this system. And we use a pumice stone in this system just to provide support for the plant.
Thanks, Bobby. We have a question about if someone was to have a system like this at home, would they notice a change in their utility or electrical bill? Do you have any sense of kind of the energy use of a system like this?
All of this stuff requires power. And so anytime you plug more things into your home than you would normally have, you're going to see some power increase. It depends on what you're doing. In a system like this, it's probably not going to be massive. The LED lights don't require a ton of energy. Your pump doesn't require a ton of energy. The chiller probably requires more energy than most of the other components in this system. If you're using some of the older light techs, such as high pressure sodium and things like that, require a lot more energy, you'd probably see an increase that is considerably more than something like this.
Thank you. And then we had a question about, have you done anything with aquaponics?
Me personally, no. I have toured some aquaponic facilities. Yeah, so I don't know a ton about it. I mean, I understand the basic principles, but I can't speak from experience in terms of operating one.
And I suppose we should start with, what is aquaponics?
Yeah, so our aquaponics is essentially a combination of hydroponics, but then also fish farming. And so you essentially will raise fish or crustaceans in a tank, and then you'll use the water in that tank to then irrigate plants. Plants will then absorb nutrients out of that system. And the idea is that the plants will help to remove any excess nutrients from that system, as animals do produce waste that produces ammonia that then produces nitrogen. And too much nitrogen and ammonia, so ammonia, nitrite, and nitrates will all kill fish and crustaceans at too high of a level. And so the idea is the plants remove the excess ammonia, nitrates, and nitrite.
Thanks, Bobby. A question about the pumice rocks you talked about. Can you use lava rocks instead when you're using this growing method?
Yep, lava rocks, expanded clay pellets. I've seen some people use really chunky perlite in this kind of system, but then again, perlite tends to float, so you may find it elsewhere if it makes its way. So the pineapples are sitting in like a net pot, which allows their roots and the nutrient solution to flow through it, but then holds that supporting substrate inside of it. And so anything that you use needs to be inert, and it needs to be larger than the holes in the net pot that you're using.
Great, thank you. So we are maybe at a good spot to go and see the final section of the display here. And so we'll give Bobby just a moment to move us there. And while he's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and show you a little bit of a close-up of what you're going to be looking at. And so he's going to be showing us a vertical growing display. And inside of those trays that we're going to be looking at, this is actually what's in the bottom. It's a little bit hard to see from Bobby's view, so I'll show you now. So this is burlap that's sitting in just a bead of water. And then on top of the burlap are seeds. These ones are kale seeds. And then once it gets going, this is the seeds after they've germinated. And so you'll be able to see this kind of in your view of Bobby's screen, but not as up close. So I wanted to just pause and make sure everyone saw what was inside of there.
So this is a nutrient film system. It is a stacked system, which is the idea of vertical farming. You've probably heard vertical farming in the news. So vertical farming generally uses a system of stacked trays and lights that maximizes your square footage. And so in here that you'll see is we have these plastic channels with the microgreens and the burlap inside. And that essentially just provides a space for the water to flow and a place to put the burlap and seeds. And there is a reservoir down here and a pump and an air stone. And so we oxygenate and circulate the water. It then gets pumped up into the trays at a very slow rate. So you have a very thin bead of water moving through the tray, and then it drains back down into your reservoir. And so these kinds of systems are really good for crops with short production times. Things like leafy greens is one of the biggest uses of this kind of system. Culinary herbs is also a big use within a system like this. When you're growing leafy greens and culinary herbs and things like that, though, you'd probably have a top to this with holes drilled in it, and you would drop individual plants down into those holes, most likely in an oasis cube or a rockwool cube. And that essentially shades out the remainder of the tray, and so you don't get algae growth on the places you don't want them. It provides a little bit more of a humid environment, too, for the roots to live inside of that nutrient solution.
Thanks, Bobby. Someone asked, have you grown lettuce in this system? And if so, they're asking if you have had any problems with outer leaf necrosis.
So we've never grown lettuce in this particular system. I have grown lettuce in similar systems, and I've never really had problems with outer leaf necrosis. We weren't keeping things around very long. We were kind of just growing it was in another large-scale hydroponic operation I used to work in. We had a section that we could grow some food for ourselves, and so we grew some leafy greens and things like that in that kind of system. But I've never done any large-scale leafy green production, mostly basil and chives, cilantro, parsley, things like that.
Thanks. And are you adding nutrients? Somebody asked, are you adding nutrients to the microgreens?
So the microgreens, no. These are being grown in just straight city water. We don't even add anything to take out the chlorine or chloramine. As the water bubbles from the air stones, it helps to release that chlorine and things like that. But if you were growing leafy greens and lettuce and stuff like that, you would have to provide more nutrients, as it is a much longer crop cycle. Microgreens, your crop cycle can be as short as 7 days, but generally takes 10 to 14 days, depending on what you're growing. And then leafy greens is generally like 4 to 8 weeks. And like leafy greens, so microgreens we see directly onto these trays, where a leafy green is, you would start the leafy green from a seed elsewhere, and then you would put them and transplant them into a system like this.
Thanks. And can you talk about, if people wanted to try a system like this at home, what advice you would give?
Really do your research first. Take a lot of time to figure out what your goals are. Say you want to produce like 2 heads of lettuce a week. You don't need to build a system that's this big. So you could build something considerably smaller. So really just know what your goals are, do the research, and then buy the components and stuff to fit those goals. It's really easy to get caught up in a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff, and you're like, well, you don't. It's like you wouldn't need a fertigation system to run a system like this. And if you're only growing a couple heads of lettuce a week, your reservoir could be as small as, say, a 5-gallon bucket. You probably have to change out your nutrient solution and make sure that that bucket is topped off regularly. But mixing a 5-gallon bucket with a nutrient solution is really not that big of a deal. So you wouldn't need all this other things. I mean, to do something like this in your own home, you could do relatively inexpensively with some maintenance, but nothing that's crazy, especially if it's something you really wanted to do. And then cleanliness is key. So every once in a while, shutting down your system, making sure all your parts are clean, making sure everything is operating appropriately. So where these things tend to fail is when that maintenance is not done. And then something gets clogged, or you have some root rot pathogen you didn't realize you had in the system. And once you have, so all the water in all these trays is connected. It's like once one plant gets that pathogen, it then starts to spread to everything else because it's all connected through that nutrient solution.
Thanks, Bobby. Someone's asking about the lights in there. What is the wattage of the lights in there?
So these are T5 high output, and I believe they're 54 watts a bulb. And so for microgreens, it's probably more than you need for microgreens, to be honest. You could probably get away. So there's 2 bulbs over top of each tray. You could probably get away with 1. We wanted the flexibility. If we ever wanted to grow leafy greens in here, you would want that extra bulb. And so we built the system with some flexibility in mind. But microgreens don't really require a ton of light. And so these are T5 high output. And so T5s have been in the industry for a very long time. And they are very much less expensive than LED grow lights at the moment. And there may be some exceptions to that. I'm not up to date on all of the new products that are coming out, unfortunately, but they are a really solid option for a home system like this, and you can find them at local hardware stores and things like that. So you could build a system like this almost entirely from components you find at a local hardware store. The other thing is your local hydroponic stores are a great resource. They have experience in these kinds of things. They can reference you specific products for your goals. So if there is a local hydroponic store in your area, go talk to them, tell them what you're trying to do, and they should be helpful to try and make that happen for you.
Thank you. Someone was asking, how often do you check the microgreen and the hydropon and the other systems? To what extent are they sort of on autopilot, and to what extent are you kind of checking and interacting with them?
So like monitoring your EC and your pH on the other 2 systems is something we do every day. We just want to make sure things are in the appropriate range. It's easy just to come by and check. We check to make sure our tank is filled with water every day. This tank will last in the fertigation system for the main drip tray. That tank will last several days, but things do happen. Say an irrigation event lasts longer for whatever reason. A solenoid gets jammed open and the water continues to flow, or something like that. So it's a good idea just to keep an eye on things on a daily basis. There are some maintenance things. It's like the lean and lower with the tomatoes. That happens once or twice a week. The cucumbers, we were literally having to do that like every day, every other day, because they were growing so fast. Strawberries are very low maintenance. Cleaning up any dead leaves and things like that is important. Remember, cleanliness is key. So it really depends on what you're doing and what your system components are. So you can't just like set it and forget it for the most part.
Right.
Yeah.
We have one question. If you could clarify again the difference between aquaponics and hydroponics.
So aquaponics has that fish or animal component. And so you're using, the only living system in these hydroponic systems is the plants themselves. To where in an aquaponics you have the plants, but then you also have the animal.
Thank you. And then with the microgreens, how long to harvest with those? And then do you change it out entirely, or how do you sort of reset it after harvest?
So it depends on what you're doing. So you can harvest, and it depends on what you want your product to be. If you like just the first 2 cotyledons that come out, you can, so these were planted like 7 days ago. And so 7 days, you have something you can cut. However, if you want the first true leaves to come out, like some chefs and places like that do, then you're going to have to wait another probably 4 or 5 days, maybe even another 7 days in order to get that product. And so it depends on what you want to be the product. If you're happy with the first 2 cotyledons, it can be very short, 5 to 7 days. And then so it's like these are growing on burlap, and so you could basically come and say you want everything. You want some just straight cotyledons, or you want some that have the true leaves. You could just cut strips of that burlap or squares off that burlap, leaving the rest of the plants in place and harvest over several days, especially if it's just for home cultivation. In a commercial environment, you would harvest the whole tray. And there are harvest machines that you could run things through to make cutting them and cleaning them up faster. You can even just come in with a pair of scissors and just cut your microgreens off of the mat. Some companies will then cut their burlap with the microgreens still on them into squares and package that into plastic clamshells and sell that at the grocery store. So it depends on what your product is.
Great, thank you. Someone had a question about, you've talked about, maintaining cleanliness in these systems. Are they impacted by waterborne diseases? And then if so, what do you do?
So yeah, Phytophthora and other root rot pathogens, it's like they can get into your systems. They can, especially if the water temperature is higher, they can grow like crazy. It's one of the important parts about keeping your nutrient solution cool, especially in a deep water recirculating system. In things like the microgreens, your turnaround time is so fast, you generally don't have a lot of those issues. That doesn't mean they can't arise if you don't keep your system clean. And so every once in a while, we may shut the whole system down, pull all the trays out, and give the whole thing a nice good scrub and sanitation, and then restart everything. And in microgreens, that's very fast. We can do that in a day, and replant that afternoon if we wanted to. What a lot of big commercial greenhouse operations are doing, especially things like tomatoes and stuff like that, is they'll grow for 11 months out of the year. They'll shut down for a month, clean and sanitize their entire system, and then get ready to plant at the end of that month.
Thanks. And then we have a question, make sure I understand it. They said, would we be able to cut the burlap and plant it into a large garden at our school for further growth? So I guess the question is, can it go from the hydroponic to in-soil growth?
It should work. It depends on how well you handle things and stuff like that. But yeah, if I wanted to keep these going, I could definitely cut a little square out of them and then plant that in a pot of dirt, and the plant would continue to grow. So that's definitely possible. You may want to thin it out a little bit. So microgreens are planted very densely in order to maximize harvest. And so you may want to pull out most of them, leave maybe 1 or 2 sprouts, and then plant those to continue on. Because if you continue to grow them in such high density, they're going to compete with each other, and you're not going to get a very good final product.
Thanks. And then we have a question about taste and growing medium. Does the medium alter the taste, say for the tomatoes? Do you know anything about studies on that or anything that you're aware of?
Not off the top of my head. A lot of that comes down to cultivar selection. And so I've tried the tomatoes in this exhibit, and if you pull them right off the vine when they're still very firm, they're a little starchy, but you let them sit on your counter, have some of those starches convert over to sugars, they get much sweeter. They are very, I like them. They're a good tasting tomato. I find them to be better than a tomato that you buy at the grocery store, which was probably harvested green and then ripened in a truck on its way to the grocery store. And so I don't know, not entirely sure when it comes to if the media directly affects the taste.
Thanks. And then do you have advice for people looking to learn how to grow hydroponically or grow indoors? Sort of how did you learn, and how would you recommend someone maybe who's not a professional grower to learn how to do this?
So I have education in a lot of this, but search engines are your friend. The internet is a great resource. There's tons of information out there. There are tons of videos that you can watch. And the more time you spend researching and learning with those inexpensive resources, the less money you're probably going to waste long-term doing things like trial and error. And there is some trial and error with all of this stuff. So it's like the first hydroponic system I built is nowhere near as good as any of these. So there is some learning as you go, but the more research you do ahead of time, the less money you're probably going to spend later. Know what your goal is, and then put the time and research into figuring out how to make that goal possible before you do anything else. So you may think that you can grow commercial lettuce in your backyard, and that may be possible, but it may be less expensive to do, say, in the ground and raise beds versus hydroponically. So just figure out all those things, know what all your little factors are, and spend the time to put into that kind of stuff before you ever go and spend money on anything. I'd spend money on education first before I went out and bought stuff. And then really build your system to what your need is. So it's like you may not need a lot of this stuff if your goal doesn't require it. So then that goes back into the research component of it.
Thanks so much, Bobby. And thanks for all the great information that you've shared during this program and for all the great questions from our participants.